Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at his broken truck. The engine had given up completely, and black smoke was still rising from under the hood. He was stuck in the middle of nowhere, 40 miles from the nearest gas station. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but sand, rocks, and the blazing afternoon sun. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. This was exactly what he needed after working 12 straight days at the oil drilling site. All he wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep for 20 hours. Instead, he was stranded in one of the hottest places on Earth. Jake grabbed his emergency kit from the back of the truck: water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a satellite phone that would take forever to connect. He'd worked in remote locations long enough to know you never traveled without backup plans. His grandfather always said, "Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." While waiting for the satellite phone to find a signal, Jake noticed something strange in the sky. A bright streak of light was moving across the blue afternoon sky, much too slow to be a shooting star. It looked like it was falling, getting bigger and brighter. Then it disappeared behind a rocky ridge about a mile away. Well, that was weird, Jake said to himself. He'd seen plenty of military jets in this area, but this looked different. The light had an unusual color, almost silver blue, and it moved in a way that didn't seem right for any aircraft he knew. The satellite phone finally beeped. Jake called his supervisor and explained the situation. Help would come, but it would take at least 3 hours. 3 hours in this heat with nothing to do but wait and drink water sparingly. That's when curiosity got the better of him. The strange light had crashed somewhere close by. Maybe it was a small plane that needed help. Maybe someone was hurt. Jake had basic first aid training from his job, and he couldn't just sit there if someone needed assistance. He packed his water bottles, first aid kit, and a flashlight into his backpack. The walk would be tough in this heat, but he'd rather be moving than sitting by a broken truck feeling helpless. Besides, if it was just space junk or military debris, at least he'd have an interesting story to tell. The desert was eerily quiet as Jake hiked toward the ridge, only the sound of his boots on rocky sand and his own breathing. The sun was merciless, and he had to stop every few minutes to drink water and rest in the shade of large rocks. After 40 minutes of walking, Jake reached the top of the ridge and looked down into a small valley. What he saw made him question his sanity. There, partially buried in the sand, was something that definitely wasn't a plane or military equipment. It looked like a metallic pod, maybe 12 feet long, with smooth curves and a surface that seemed to shimmer like water. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Lying motionless near the strange craft was a person, a woman by the looks of it, wearing clothes that seemed to be made of some kind of flowing, silvery material. She wasn't moving. Jake scrambled down the hillside as fast as he could without falling. His first aid training kicked in immediately. Check for breathing, check for injuries, assess the situation. As he got closer, he could see the woman was unconscious but breathing. She had cuts on her arms and forehead, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. Something about her seemed unusual, though Jake couldn't put his finger on what exactly. Her skin had a slight luminescent quality, like she was lit from within. Her hair was the most beautiful shade of silver blue he'd ever seen, and it seemed to shift colors slightly in the sunlight. But she was clearly human, and she clearly needed help. Without hesitation, Jake opened his water bottle and carefully lifted her head. "Hey, can you hear me? You're going to be okay." He gently poured small amounts of water between her lips, making sure she didn't choke. Most of his emergency water supply was gone within minutes, but seeing someone in distress triggered every protective instinct he had. While she slowly regained consciousness, Jake used his first aid kit to clean and bandage her wounds. She was lucky. The injuries looked worse than they actually were, mostly cuts and bruises, probably from being thrown around when her vehicle crashed. When her eyes finally opened, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They seemed to hold depths of starlight, changing from deep blue to silver depending on how the light hit them. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and overwhelming gratitude. She tried to speak, but the sounds that came out weren't in any language Jake recognized. It was musical, almost like singing, but definitely speech. She seemed frustrated that he couldn't understand, so she pointed to herself and made sounds that might have been her name. Then she pointed to the water bottle and to him, and her expression became incredibly serious. After a few minutes of struggling with the strange language, she suddenly spoke in English, though with an accent Jake couldn't place. Her voice was soft but clear. You saved me. You gave me water when you had so little." She looked around at the harsh desert, then back at Jake with those incredible eyes. "By the customs of my people, this means I belong to you now. I am yours." Jake blinked several times, sure he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what? Look, I just gave you some water because you were dehydrated. You don't belong to anyone. Are you feeling okay? Did you hit your head when you crashed?" She sat up slowly, still weak but determined to make him understand. "My name is Lyra Lay. I come from very far away. Where I come from, water is the most precious gift. When someone shares their water to save your life, it creates a sacred bond. You are now my protector, and I am now yours to protect." Jake looked from her to the strange craft half buried in the sand, then back to her otherworldly eyes. Either this woman had a serious head injury, or his boring life as a petroleum engineer had just taken the most unexpected turn imaginable. Given the circumstances, he was starting to suspect it might be the latter. "Okay, Lyra Lay," he said gently. "Let's focus on getting you somewhere safe first. Then we can figure out everything else." He helped her stand, and she leaned against him, still weak from her ordeal. As they prepared to make the difficult walk back to his truck, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The walk back to Jake's truck was the longest mile of his life. Lyra Lay leaned against him for support, and every few steps she would stop and stare at something ordinary like a cactus or a lizard running across the sand. She seemed amazed by everything, as if she was seeing a desert for the first time. "Where exactly are you from?" Jake asked as they rested in the shade of a large rock. He was still trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The metallic craft looked like nothing he'd ever encountered, but maybe it was some kind of experimental military vehicle. Maybe Lyra Lay was a test pilot who'd gotten confused after a crash. Lyra Lay looked up at the sky, even though it was still. Bright afternoon, she pointed to a spot where no stars were visible. "My world orbits a star you call Kepler 442. It takes light from your sun about 1/200 of your years to reach my home." She said it so casually, like she was giving directions to the nearest grocery store. Jake stopped walking. "Okay, I think you definitely have a concussion. Let me check your pupils again." He pulled out his flashlight, but when he looked into her eyes, her pupils responded normally to the light. Everything seemed medically fine, which somehow made everything more confusing. "I know this is difficult to believe," Lyra Lay said gently. "Your people aren't ready for contact with other worlds yet. That's why I was sent alone, to study your cultures quietly. But my ship had problems when I entered your atmosphere. The electromagnetic fields around your planet are different than we expected." Despite himself, Jake was starting to pay attention. She spoke about electromagnetic fields like someone who actually understood them, not like someone making up a story. And there were little things about her that didn't quite add up to any explanation that made sense. When they reached his truck, Jake gave her more water and watched her drink. As she tilted her head back, he noticed that small cuts on her neck were already starting to heal. Not scab over like normal cuts, but actually close up and disappear. The larger cuts on her arms looked days old instead of hours old. "How are you doing that?" he asked, pointing to where a cut had been on her wrist. Lyrelei looked confused. "Doing what?" "The healing thing. Those cuts are disappearing." She examined her arm like she was noticing it for the first time. "Oh, this is normal. For my people, we heal quickly from small injuries. Does this not happen with humans?" Jake shook his head slowly. "No, it definitely does not happen with humans. That's when things got even stranger." A roadrunner appeared from behind some rocks and ran straight toward them. Instead of darting away when it saw people, it stopped right in front of Lyrelei and tilted its head like it was listening to something. Lyrelei made soft clicking sounds, and the bird responded with its own calls. They seemed to be having a conversation. After a minute, the roadrunner ran off, but not before dropping a small lizard at Lyrelei's feet. "He says thank you for the water you shared," Lyrelei explained. "Desert creatures understand the value of water better than anyone." Jake sat down heavily on his truck's tailgate. "Right. So you can talk to animals too. All living things communicate if you know how to listen." Lyrelei picked up the lizard gently and placed it in the shade. On my world, this is considered a basic skill, like your reading or writing. As the afternoon wore on, Jake's rational mind kept battling with what he was seeing. When Lyrelei described her planet, she talked about 2 suns and purple oceans with the detail of someone who had actually seen them. When she mentioned the political situation that had forced her to leave, her voice carried real sadness and fear. "You said something about belonging to me because I gave you water," Jake said eventually. "What did you mean by that?" Lyrelei's cheeks turned a slightly silver color, which Jake assumed was her version of blushing. "On my world, water is not as common as it is here. When someone shares their water to save your life, it means they value you more than their own survival. It creates a bond called shaltai, which means life shared with life. In your language, you might call it marriage." Jake nearly choked on his own water. "Marriage! I just gave you a drink because you were dehydrated. That's what any decent person would do. But you were stranded in the desert with limited water," Lyrelei pointed out. "You gave me most of your supply when you could have kept it for yourself. By my people's understanding, this means you chose my life over your own safety. This is the deepest form of commitment possible." "Okay, but that's your culture, not mine," Jake said, trying to be gentle but firm. "I was just helping someone who needed help. That doesn't mean we're married or that you belong to me. People don't belong to other people." Lyrelei looked genuinely puzzled. "Then how do your people show ultimate commitment to each other?" Jake thought about it. "Well, we date first, get to know each other, fall in love, then maybe get married. But both people have to choose it freely, and even then, it's about being partners, not owning each other. So, you must choose to care for someone before you save their life?" This concept seemed to fascinate her. "How do you know if someone is worth saving if you don't know them yet? You save people because they're people, because life has value." Lyrelei was quiet for a long time, processing this. "Your species is more generous than mine," she finally said. "We save those who are precious to us. You save everyone, even strangers." Just then, flowers began blooming around Jake's truck. Actual flowers growing up through the sand in the middle of the desert. Small blue ones that seemed to glow softly in the fading sunlight. "Are you doing that?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "It happens when I'm happy," Lyrelei admitted. "I cannot control it when I feel strong emotions. I'm sorry if it disturbs you." Jake watched more flowers bloom in a circle around where they sat. Despite everything his logical mind was telling him, he found himself believing her story. The evidence was literally growing around his feet. "So what happens now?" he asked. "If you're really from another planet, don't your people expect you back?" Lyrelei's expression grew sad. They expect me to complete my mission and return to fulfill an arranged union with someone I do not wish to be bonded to. But now that you have saved me, everything has changed. According to our laws, I cannot be bonded to another while I am already shall tied to you. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. His simple act of kindness had apparently created an interstellar incident, and despite how crazy everything was, he was starting to care what happened to this strange, beautiful woman who made flowers bloom in the desert. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted his thoughts. Help was finally coming, but Jake had a feeling his problems were just beginning. The rescue truck that arrived wasn't what Jake expected. Instead of the bright yellow tow truck from Peterson's garage, 3 black SUVs pulled up in a cloud of dust. Men in dark suits got out, and Jake immediately knew he'd made a terrible mistake. Mr. Martinez? The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an all-business attitude. "I'm Agent Chen. We need to talk about your phone call to dispatch." Jake's heart sank. When he'd called his supervisor about being stranded, he'd mentioned finding someone at a crash site. He thought he was just explaining why he might be late getting back. He never imagined those words would trigger some kind of government response. "Look, I just found someone who needed help," Jake said, stepping slightly in front of Lay. "There's no need for all this." Agent Chen's eyes moved to Lay, who was trying to hide behind Jake's truck. The flowers that had been blooming around them moments earlier were now wilting rapidly, as if they sensed danger. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for a few questions," Agent Chen said to Lay. Her tone was polite, but firm. "Standard procedure for anyone involved in an unidentified aircraft incident." "She's not involved in anything," Jake protested. "She was just hiking and got lost. I gave her some water and called for help. That's it." But even as he said it, Jake knew how weak his story sounded. Lay was still wearing those strange silvery clothes that definitely weren't hiking gear. Her otherworldly beauty was impossible to miss, and there was something about the way she moved that seemed different from any person these agents had ever seen. "Sir, we detected unusual electromagnetic readings from this location," another agent said, "consulting some kind of electronic device, along with what appears to be debris from an unidentified craft. We need to investigate." Jake watched in growing panic as more agents spread out across the desert, clearly searching for Lyralee's ship. He caught her eye and saw fear there, but also something else. She was trying to communicate with him without words, her unusual eyes flickering between him and the agents. "I need to use the restroom," Lyralee said suddenly, her voice shaking slightly. "Is there somewhere private I can go?" Agent Chen pointed toward a portable facility one of the vehicles had brought. "Agent Rodriguez will escort you." But as they walked toward the facility, something incredible happened. Lyralee simply stepped through the side of it like it was made of air, leaving Agent Rodriguez staring at solid metal. She reappeared 30 feet away, behind another vehicle. The agents immediately drew their weapons, shouting commands. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized how quickly the situation had escalated from a rescue to something that looked like a standoff. "Nobody move!" Agent Chen yelled. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle and put your hands where we can see them." Lyralee looked terrified, and when she was scared, her abilities seemed to activate automatically. The temperature around them dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Frost began forming on the agent's sunglasses. The electronic devices they were carrying started beeping wildly and then went silent. "She's not dangerous," Jake shouted, stepping between the agents and Lyralee. "She's just scared. Lower your weapons." "Sir, step away from the subject immediately," Agent Chen commanded. "We have protocols for situations like this." "Situations like what?" Jake demanded. "You mean helping someone who's lost?" Agent Chen's expression was grim. "Mr. Martinez, this isn't our first encounter with individuals displaying unusual abilities. We have procedures in place to protect both the public and the individuals involved." That statement hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. They dealt with others like Lyrelei before. That meant there were more people from other worlds, and it meant the government knew about them. "What happened to the others?" Jake asked quietly. "Agent." Chen didn't answer directly, but her silence told him everything he needed to know. Jake felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him. He barely knew Lyrelei, but the idea of her disappearing into some government facility made his chest tight with worry. Meanwhile, Lyrelei was backing toward the desert, her fear making the air around her shimmer like a heat mirage. Jake could feel emotions that weren't his own flooding his mind. Her terror, her confusion, her desperate desire to flee, but also her unwillingness to leave him behind. "You can hear my thoughts," Jake said to her, understanding flooding through him. It wasn't a question. Lyrelei nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The shale-tie bond. It grows stronger when one of us is in danger. I am so sorry, Jake. I never meant to bring trouble to your life." Agent Chen was speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for backup and what sounded like specialized equipment. More vehicles were approaching in the distance, kicking up dust clouds on the horizon. "We need to go," Lyrelei whispered in Jake's mind. "They will separate us. They will study me like an animal in a cage, and they will make you forget you ever met me." Jake felt his world tilting. Everything he'd believed about his government, his country, his reality was crumbling around him. But looking at Lyrelei's frightened face, only one thing mattered. "Can you get us out of here?" he asked quietly. "If you trust me completely, yes. But once we leave this way, there will be no going back to your normal life. They will hunt us." Jake looked around at the agents surrounding them, at the approaching vehicles, at Agent Chen, who was clearly preparing to separate them permanently. He thought about his quiet life, his steady job, his small apartment that he'd never see again. Then, he looked at Lyrelei, this incredible person who had literally fallen from the stars into his life. Someone who made flowers bloom in the desert and shared her thoughts with him. Someone who needed his protection. "I trust you," he said aloud. Agent Chen spun toward them, realizing something was happening. "Don't do anything stupid, Martinez." But it was too late. Lyrelei reached for Jake's hand, and the moment their fingers touched, the world around them became translucent. Jake felt like he was dissolving and reforming at the same time. The agent's shouts became distant echoes. When the sensation stopped, they were standing on a cliff 5 miles away, looking down at the tiny black vehicles in the desert below. Jake's truck looked like a toy from this distance. "How did you do?" "That?" Jake gasped, still feeling dizzy from whatever had just happened. "Matter is mostly empty space," Lyrelei explained, looking exhausted from the effort. "My people learned long ago how to move between the spaces. But it takes great energy, and I cannot do it again for many hours." Jake watched the government, vehicles spreading out in search patterns below them. His old life was definitely over. He was now officially on the run from his own government, protecting someone they considered either a threat or a prize. The strange thing was, he didn't regret it. For the first time in his life, he was doing something that felt truly important, something that mattered more than drilling schedules and equipment maintenance. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Lyrelei squeezed his hand, and he felt her gratitude and determination through their strange connection. "Now we disappear, and I tell you the real reason I came to your world." 3 weeks of hiding in remote desert locations taught Jake more about survival than his entire life up to that point. Lyrelei knew things about finding water and edible plants that seemed impossible, but then again, everything about her seemed impossible. They'd been moving constantly, staying in abandoned mining shacks, empty park ranger stations, and caves that Lyrelei somehow knew were safe. She had an incredible ability to sense when helicopters or search teams were getting close, giving them just enough time to disappear before being spotted. "How do you always know when they're coming?" Jake asked one evening as they sat around a small fire in a hidden canyon. They'd been sharing stories about their different worlds, and Jake was starting to understand just how extraordinary his companion really was. "Your people use machines that send out signals," Lyreley explained, poking at the fire with a stick. "Those signals feel like someone shouting in a quiet library, very obvious once you know what to listen for." Jake watched her face in the firelight. Over the past weeks, he'd learned that she was incredibly intelligent, surprisingly funny, and had a way of seeing beauty in things he'd never noticed before. She could spend an hour watching ants work together or get excited about the way morning light hit a cactus flower. "There's something I need to tell you," Lyreley said suddenly, her voice becoming serious, "about why I really came to your world." Jake had been wondering when this conversation would happen. In quiet moments, he'd caught glimpses of sadness. In her thoughts, memories of something that had driven her to risk everything by leaving her home. "I wasn't just an envoy studying Earth cultures," she began, staring into the flames. "I was running away. On my world, marriages are arranged to create political alliances between territories. My family controls resources that another powerful family wants access to." She paused, gathering courage to continue. "Lord Vextar is a cruel leader who has been expanding his territory through force. He demanded a union with me to gain control of my family's water and energy sources. If I had agreed, he would have had enough power to dominate our entire planet." Jake felt anger building in his chest, some of it his own and some of it bleeding through their mental connection. "So you ran away rather than marry someone horrible?" "I tried to escape to the outer settlements, but Vexatar's ships followed me. My only choice was to leave our solar system entirely. Earth was the closest habitable world, and your people weren't supposed to be advanced enough to detect my ship." She smiled sadly. "I did not plan for your planet's unusual electromagnetic fields or for crash landing in a desert, and definitely didn't plan on meeting a guy who'd share his water with a stranger," Jake added. Lyreley's expression softened. "No, I did not plan for that. Where I come from, such kindness between strangers is rare. Most people would have left me to die rather than risk their own survival." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thought. Jake was processing the fact that he'd somehow become involved in what amounted to interplanetary politics. Lyreley was wanted by a tyrant who would use her to oppress millions of people. "What would happen if you went back?" Jake asked. "If I returned unmarried, Vextar would simply force the union anyway. My people's laws say that a woman cannot refuse a marriage alliance if it serves the greater good." Her voice became bitter. "Of course, Vextar gets to decide what serves the greater good. But you're not unmarried," Jake pointed out. "You said we're bonded according to your customs." Lyreley looked at him with surprise. "You still think of our shall tie as real, even though it was created by misunderstanding?" Jake had been thinking about this question for weeks. Maybe it started as a misunderstanding, but it doesn't feel like one anymore. It was true. Somewhere between escaping government agents and learning to survive in the wilderness together, Jake had fallen completely in love with Lyreley. Not just with her otherworldly beauty or amazing abilities, but with her curiosity about everything, her gentle way with animals, and her determination to protect people she'd never met from a tyrant's rule. "I feel the same way," Lyreley whispered, and Jake realized she'd been listening to his thoughts. "But our feelings do not change the situation. Vexatar will not accept our bond as legitimate since you are not from our world." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by a familiar sensation. Lyreley's head snapped up, her body tensing like a deer sensing danger. "They found us again," she said. "But something is different this time. There are two groups approaching from different directions." Jake quickly put out the fire and grabbed their emergency packs. They'd gotten good at leaving no trace behind, but as they prepared to move, lights appeared in the sky above them. Not helicopters or planes, but something that moved with the same fluid grace as Lyrale's crashed ship. No, Lyrale breathed, fear flooding through their connection. They followed me here. 3 ships descended into the canyon, their hulls gleaming silver in the moonlight. As they landed, figures emerged wearing clothes similar to Lyrale's but more elaborate, more official-looking. Princess Lyrale, one of them called out in that musical language Jake had first heard her speak. By order of the High Council, you must return home immediately. Lyrale responded in the same language, her voice defiant. The conversation became heated, with lots of gestures and what sounded like arguments. Meanwhile, Jake could hear vehicles approaching from the other end of the canyon. Agent Chen and her team had tracked them down at the worst possible moment. What are they saying? Jake asked quietly. They say my absence has created a crisis, Lyrale translated, still arguing with the newcomers. Vextar is claiming I was kidnapped and is using it as an excuse to attack my family's territory. People are dying because of my choice to run away. Jake's heart sank. He'd known their time together couldn't last forever, but he'd hoped they'd have longer to figure out a solution. They're offering compensation to your people, Lyrale continued. Advanced technology, medical knowledge, energy sources that could solve many of your world's problems, all in exchange for allowing me to return and fulfill my obligations. The Bab. Government vehicles had reached the canyon entrance. Bright lights swept across the rocky walls as agents moved into position. Jake and Lyrale were trapped between 2 groups who both wanted to separate them. There has to be another way, Jake said desperately. Some solution that doesn't involve you sacrificing your happiness for politics. One of Lyrale's people, who seemed to be their leader, approached Jake directly. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English. Human, we appreciate your care for the princess, but you do not understand the consequences of keeping her here. Millions will suffer if she does not return. Jake looked between the alien official, the approaching government agents, and Lyrale's frightened face. Everything he'd learned about leadership during his years managing drilling crews told him that the best solutions usually came from thinking outside the box. What if she returns but not as Vextar's prisoner? Jake asked. What if she comes back with a better offer? An alliance that doesn't require her to marry someone she doesn't love? The alien leader looked intrigued despite himself. What kind of alliance could you possibly offer? Jake took a deep breath, about to suggest something that would change his life forever. A formal diplomatic relationship between our worlds, with me as Earth's first ambassador. Before anyone could respond, Agent Chen's voice echoed across the canyon through a loudspeaker. This is the United States government. Everyone needs to remain calm and prepare for peaceful contact. Lyrale grabbed Jake's hand as the 3-way standoff intensified. Whatever happened next would determine the Yahtzee, fate of both their worlds. The canyon had become the strangest diplomatic meeting in human history. Agent Chen and her team faced off against 3 alien ships, while Jake and Lyrale stood in the middle, trying to prevent an interplanetary incident. Let me understand this correctly, Agent Chen said, her voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances. You're from another planet. There's some kind of political crisis involving forced marriage, and Mr. Martinez here has somehow become involved in alien politics. Commander Zexhal, the leader of Lyrale's people, nodded gravely. Your summary is accurate, though it lacks the complexity of our situation. Princess Lyrale's marriage to Lord Vextar would prevent a devastating war on our world, but it would also give him enough power to eventually threaten other worlds, including yours. Jake felt like he was in a movie, except the stakes were real and the fate of 2 civilizations might depend on decisions made in the next few hours. What exactly are you proposing? Agent Chen asked Jake directly. A real alliance, Jake said. his mind racing. Not one based on fear or forced marriages, but on mutual benefit. Earth gets access to advanced technology that could solve climate change, disease, energy problems. Lyra Lay's world gets a new ally against Vextar, and she doesn't have to sacrifice her life to politics. Commander Zexhal looked skeptical. Your world is barely space-capable. What could you offer us? Agent Chen stepped forward, and Jake was surprised to see genuine interest in her eyes. Actually, we might have more to offer than you think. Earth has something most advanced civilizations lose: diversity of thought. We solve problems differently because we come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different ways of thinking. Plus, Jake added, getting excited about the idea, humans are really good at adaptation and survival. We've lived through ice ages, plagues, wars, natural disasters. We don't give up easily. Lyra Lay had been quiet during this discussion, but Jake could feel her hope growing through their mental connection. For the first time since her people arrived, she looked like she believed there might be a way out of her situation. Even if this alliance were possible, Commander Zexhal said slowly, the High Council would never accept a human as a legitimate diplomat. You have no training, no understanding of our customs, no authority to speak for your world. But I do, Agent Chen said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. I've been authorized by my government to make preliminary contact with any extraterrestrial civilizations we encounter. If Mr. Martinez is willing to serve as a cultural liaison, and if Princess Lyra Lay agrees to return as part of a formal diplomatic mission rather than a marriage alliance, we could make this work. Jake's heart was pounding. They were actually talking about him leaving Earth, traveling to another world, becoming humanity's first ambassador to an alien civilization. There's one more problem, Lyra Lay said sadly. Even if your governments agree, Vexitar will not simply accept defeat. He'll claim the alliance is invalid and attack anyway. Too many people will die. Then we need to make sure he can't attack, Jake said. What if instead of just an alliance between your world and Earth, we create something bigger? A coalition of worlds that oppose tyrants like Vextar? Commander Zexhal's eyes widened. You're talking about reshaping interplanetary politics across multiple star systems. I'm talking about giving bullies what they deserve, Jake replied. Isolation and consequences for their actions. Over the next hour, the most unlikely group of negotiators in history worked out the framework for what would become known as the Kepler Accords. Earth would provide human ambassadors and unique perspectives on conflict resolution. Lyra Lay's world would share advanced technology and serve as a bridge to other civilizations. Together, they would build a network of worlds, committed to preventing aggressive expansion by tyrants like Vextar. But the personal cost was enormous. Jake would have to leave everything behind, his job, his family, his entire world, to make this work. And there was no guarantee he'd ever be able to return to Earth. I need to know, Jake said to Lyra Lee privately as the officials worked out details. Are you doing this because you want to, or because you feel obligated because of our bond? Lyra Lee took his hands in hers, and he felt the full depth of her emotions through their connection. Love, gratitude, hope, fear, determination, all mixed together in a way that was uniquely hers. I am doing this because for the first time in my life I get to choose, she said. And I choose you. I choose us. I choose the possibility that love can be stronger than politics. As dawn broke over the canyon, Jake stood looking at Lyra Lay's repaired ship. It was beautiful in the morning light, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift color with the changing sky. In a few hours, he would either board that ship and leave Earth forever, or watch it disappear into the stars without him. Agent Chen approached him with a satellite phone. Your family is on the line. We've told them you're being offered a unique government position that requires extended travel. They don't need to know the full details yet. Jake talked to his parents, his sister, his few close friends. He told them he loved them, that he was doing something important, and that he'd find a way to stay in touch. He couldn't explain that extended travel meant 40 light-years away. When he hung up, Lyra Lee was waiting for him by the ship's entrance. She'd changed into traveling clothes that looked like they were made of liquid starlight. "Are you ready?" she asked. Jake looked around the canyon where his old life had ended and his new one was about to begin. He thought about his small apartment, his predictable job, his quiet life that had been completely ordinary until 3 weeks ago. Then he thought about Lyra Lie, about the possibility of preventing wars across multiple worlds, about becoming humanity's voice in a galaxy full of wonders he'd never imagined. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I don't know anything about being a diplomat or living on an alien world or any of this." "I was terrified when I crashed in your desert," Lyra Lie replied. "But you saved me anyway. Now we save each other." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the same water bottle he'd used to save Lyra Lie's life. It was empty now, but it had started everything. He looked at it for a moment, then handed it to Agent Chen. "Make sure this gets to the Smithsonian someday," he said, "with a note that says, 'Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything.'" Then he took Lyra Lee's hand and stepped into the ship. As they lifted off, Jake watched Earth shrink below them until it was just a blue dot among countless stars. He was leaving behind everything he'd ever known, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He was holding the hand of someone who'd made flowers bloom in the desert just by being happy. Whatever challenges waited among the stars, they'd face them together. The last thing he saw before the ship jumped to light speed was Agent Chen waving goodbye from the canyon floor, still holding his water bottle. Then Earth was gone, and Jake Martinez, petroleum engineer turned interplanetary ambassador, began the greatest adventure in human history. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Sometimes a broken truck in the Nevada desert leads to saving 2 worlds. And sometimes when you give water to a stranger, you end up changing the fate of the galaxy. But mostly, sometimes love really is the most powerful force in the universe.